Today's three stories are about people who saw and heard things that they swore happened and were totally real. Yet, their accounts are just impossible. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button goes away on vacation, offer to take care of their beautifully manicured lawn for them, but instead just put instant mashed potato mix all over the lawn and start the sprinklers. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One night in 1943, a Catholic priest named Father Paul Liut was getting ready for bed in the back room of his church in Paris, France. Father Paul was a quiet, dedicated man who spent most of his days helping the people of his parish navigate the daily struggles of living in an occupied city. On this particular night, he had finished his evening prayers in the main sanctuary, blown out the candles, and walked down the narrow, creaky wooden stairs to his private quarters located behind the altar. His room was small and sparse, containing only a simple wooden bed, a writing desk, and a ceramic basin for washing. He had just removed his heavy cassock and washed his face with cold water when he heard a sudden, sharp sound break the silence of the building. The church doorbell was ringing, and Father Paul was quite surprised by this because number one, it was almost midnight, and number two, World War II was going on. Paris was occupied by the Nazis, and the whole city was under a very strict curfew. So if somebody was here, they were breaking that curfew. But it also meant if somebody was here breaking the curfew to talk to him at midnight, it must be urgent. So he rushed to the door to see who it was. He walked slowly through the dark hallway, his sandals making a soft slapping sound against the cold stone floor of the empty, cavernous church. The air was freezing, and his breath formed small, white clouds in the dim light. He reached the heavy wooden front door, unlocked the thick iron bolt, and pulled it open. When he opened up the church door, he saw this frantic-looking middle-aged woman who was standing out on the steps. And she looked totally panicked. Her coat was damp from the night mist, and she was breathing heavily as if she had been running for a long distance. She looked up at Father Paul and begged him to come with her quickly. She told him that a young man was dying and he needed someone to say his last rites. This sacrament was incredibly important in the Catholic faith, as it meant preparing a soul for the afterlife, and Father Paul felt a deep spiritual obligation to help. Father Paul instinctively poked his head out the door and just looked up and down the road. He was scanning the street outside for soldiers or police. He knew that if he and this woman were spotted out past curfew, they would be arrested. And so obviously this would be a huge risk to do what she was asking. But to Father Paul, if someone was dying, he had to go. He had to let this person have their last rites. Now, Father Paul knew it would be safest if he and this woman actually traveled separately to where this young man was. He told the woman to wait, stepped back inside, and grabbed a small leather-bound notebook and a graphite pencil from his desk. He handed them to the woman and asked her to write down the address. The woman took the pencil, her hands trembling violently from panic and cold, and quickly scribbled down the street name and the building number. She handed the notebook back to him. Father Paul looked at the address and told her he would be there in just a few minutes, advising her to run back ahead of him. She nodded, turned around, and took off running down the dark, empty street, quickly disappearing into the shadows. Not long after that, Father Paul hurried down this pitch-black street full of all these old limestone buildings, scanning for the address the woman had written down on this piece of paper. The streets of Paris were pitch black because of the wartime blackout regulations. The only illumination came from the faint light of the stars. Father Paul walked quickly, keeping close to the walls of the old buildings and stepping into deep shadows whenever he heard a distant sound. His heart was in his throat, and every shadow looked like a soldier waiting to arrest him. He navigated the winding, narrow alleyways, constantly checking his notebook to make sure he was on the right path. He eventually found the building number, and he rushed up and knocked on the door because he needed to get off the street as fast as possible. He stood there, his eyes darting back and forth, waiting for someone to answer. Through the small glass pane of the door, he saw a faint light turn on inside, and then he saw these thick curtains inside of this apartment. They parted slightly, and someone looked out, and then a moment later, the door opened slightly. Immediately, Father Paul basically pushed himself into the apartment. He did not even know who was in here, but he needed to get inside because it was not safe outside. And so, Father Paul gets inside and he looks and he sees there is a young man standing there who has just let him in. This was presumably his apartment. And Father Paul does not see the woman who had told him to come here. But also, Father Paul is realizing, I do not see any sign of somebody dying here. And so, it is sort of like this weird situation. The young man is looking at Father Paul, wondering what is going on, and Father Paul is doing the same. And Father Paul, he says, I was given this address to come give someone their last rites. I was told by a woman that there is somebody dying here. Like, is there someone dying here? The young man is sort of looking at Father Paul and just looking all around him, and he says, "No, I am the only one here. I have no idea what you were talking about," and so Father Paul says, "Well, wait a minute, is this the right address? Am I at the right address? Because this woman was convinced somebody was dying here. Is this the right address?" And the young man looks at the address and says, "Yeah, no, that is definitely right. You are at the right address." So Father Paul says, "How weird is that? Are you sure there is nobody here that is dying?" And the young man says, "No, really, it is just me. I have no idea what this is about." And so Father Paul told this young man, "Hey, let's just wait a minute because this woman is bound to show up any minute. I mean, she is the one who told me to come here. She is the one who said somebody was dying. When she gets here, we will let her in and she can explain what happened." But the two of them just sort of awkwardly stood there inside of this apartment, looking out the window, waiting for this woman. But quite a bit of time went by and she never showed up, and so eventually the two of them, the father and this young man, they say, "Man, that is weird. Like, that is just a mix-up, I guess. What else could it be? He is at the right address, there is a man here, but he is clearly okay. It was just a weird thing." And so Father Paul and this young man, they just sort of talked about how weird this was, and the father was about to leave when the young man says, "Hey, wait a minute. Since you are here, I have not spoken to a priest in a long time, and given what is going on in the world, I would love to be able to speak to you and confess my sins. Would you be willing to just stay here for a minute and just let me speak to you?" And Father Paul says, "Of course. I am here and already intruded into your home." Like, of course. And so the two of them sat down inside of the apartment. The woman never showed up, and these two complete strangers basically just talked for a while. The young man confessed his sins, got his burdens off his mind, and got right with God in a sense. He spoke about his fears of the occupation and his worry for his family. Father Paul listened with deep empathy, offered words of comfort, and granted him absolution. The young man looked incredibly peaceful, as if a massive weight had been lifted from his soul. And eventually, after his confessional was done, the priest thanked the young man, wished him well, and then he went back outside. And immediately when the father was outside, it had been pretty quiet to that point, but the second he got out there onto the road, the air raid sirens began going off all through the city. And so at this point, Father Paul had a decision to make. Either run home as he planned to and just take shelter inside of his own home and hope he survived the inevitable bombing run that apparently was coming through any minute now. That is what the sirens were for. Or, given the sirens going off, he knew anytime that happened, a bombing run followed and dozens of people were going to get killed. That is how it always went, and they had these things in the city called casualty clearing centers, which were like these intermediary spots before folks got sent to hospitals, which could become overwhelmed really quickly with casualties. At these clearing centers, officials would basically determine whether or not somebody was salvageable. And Father Paul knew these clearing centers really needed a lot of priests to give last rites and to provide their spiritual services to these people that are casualties of war. And so for Father Paul, as the sirens are going off, the decision was easy. He turned and he ran right towards that clearing center, and as Father Paul got closer to the clearing center, he was already hearing the sound of bombs impacting buildings and streets not far away from him. He was basically running through an air raid. The ground shook, and the deep, terrifying rumble of explosions echoed through the streets. Bombs were impacting buildings not far away, and the air was filled with thick smoke and plaster dust. He eventually made it to this shelter area, this clearing center. He rushed inside, and when he got in there, he found that it was actually already really crowded with patients lying on stretchers or huddled on the floor, and nurses were rushing back and forth with bandages and medicine. It was just like this horrifying, chaotic scene, and this was before a rush of new casualties had even arrived. The bombing was happening now, and these people were just leftovers from the last round of attacks. These were people that got passed over, if you will, and were told to stay here and not be sent to the hospital. And so, this place was already basically full of dying and mortally wounded people. And very shortly after Father Paul got in there, another rush of freshly injured people from this particular bombing run began being rushed inside. It was total madness, and so for the next few hours, Father Paul just went all around this clearing center, looking for the people who were the most critically injured, who were the least likely to survive the night. And he would pray with them in their final moments, holding their hands and speaking comforting words. Then, a little before dawn, Father Paul saw one victim who just completely stopped him in his tracks. It was this young man who was obviously deceased, who was lying on the ground with brutal injuries all over his body. And it was the same young man whom Father Paul had seen at that random address he had run to, believing he was going to find a dying man. That same young man who was healthy, who was fine, who did his confession to Father Paul, that young man was dead inside of this clearing center, clearly killed by the most recent bombing run. Now, Father Paul had been witnessing war like the rest of the residents of Paris for some time, but he was still just really shaken up by this. He knew very likely, considering this young man lived alone, that he, Father Paul, was the last person to speak to him before he died. So, in some ways, he was very grateful that the young man had asked him to stay back and allow him to confess and get right with God, because it turned out he was about to die. And so, Father Paul, without really knowing what else to do, began reaching into this young man's pockets to find hopefully a wallet or just any of his valuables, just to make sure he could return these things to this young man's family. He wanted to make sure he could not only give these things back to them, but also pay his condolences and tell the family that he did have a chance to see their son before he died. He wanted to do that for the family, and eventually, Father Paul pulled out this man's wallet. And when he opened it, in addition to his identification card and a few other things, he found 2 photos. The first was of this middle-aged woman, and on the back of this photo was a single word. It just said mom, but written in French, which was maman. And at first, Father Paul really did not think twice about this. But when he flipped the photograph back over and looked at the image again, looked at this woman again, he realized this was the woman who had come to his church to say, "You have to go give this dying man his last rites." The woman who never showed up at the address, it was his mother. He was completely stunned, unable to comprehend how she could have known her son was going to die. How could this be? What was going on here? And so Father Paul really did not know what to even think here. This was like truly unbelievable. But it only got weirder. He looked at the second photo in this young man's wallet. And this photo as well was of his mother. Except in this photo, his mother was clearly dead. She was laying in a coffin with a crucifix wrapped around her hands that were resting on her chest. She was dead. And this photo, the photo of her dead, was dated on the back, April 8th, 1939, which meant this woman whom Father Paul saw at his church that night, who led him to the young man who wound up dying in the bombing run, that woman had died 4 years ago. Father Paul would ultimately contact the family of this young man, and he confirmed that the pictures were definitely his mother and that she really had died 4 years earlier. And also, Father Paul requested a sample of this young man's mother's handwriting to compare the address that he was given by this woman to a known sample of her handwriting. And the handwriting matched exactly. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Every once in a while, something will remind me of a time when staying connected with people just felt a whole lot more effortless. There was less planning, fewer distractions, and somehow there was just way more time for the people around you. And so when I look back at those times, it is hard not to wish I had sort of appreciated those times more when they were happening. When something feels off in your life, you may find yourself thinking about a simpler time in the past when, relationships felt more natural, when being around people did not seem to require so much effort. And then you sort of look at your current life and think, boy, it really feels different now. Staying connected in some ways is super automatic with social media and the internet, but it does not feel natural. It does not feel effortless like it used to. But what you are often missing when you look back at this time is not just those people. It is really the experience of connection with them feeling so effortless. Therapy can help you make sense of what has changed and may also help you recognize and nurture the connection that is still very much available to you today. Even if it does not look exactly the way it once did. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. Switch anytime at no extra cost if it is not the right fit. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. On the morning of March 17, 2019, a young businessman named Fun rolled a suitcase into the lobby of a hotel in Wu County, which is in central China. And he was followed by a young woman named Yomi, who was also carrying some luggage. And as soon as they were in there, they both just sort of did a look around. They saw the stained carpet and the outdated furniture, and they smelled a funky smell. The lobby was dim, and the carpet was heavily stained with dark, unsightly patches. The furniture looked like it had not been replaced in decades, and there was a strange, damp, musty smell hanging in the air that made them both uncomfortable. And they both just sort of looked at each other. And it was obvious as they exchanged this glance that they both were thinking the same thing. This hotel was a total dump. So Fun and Yomi were co-workers, and they were here on a week-long business trip. Fun had assumed they would be staying somewhere nice, but clearly the company had other thoughts. They were probably trying to save money by putting them in this budget hotel in a crappy area because the company had decided to cut corners after a difficult financial quarter. But Fun knew, realistically, the two of them could not really change this. This is what their company was putting them up in. It is what it is, So, he and Yomi just kind of shrugged, and then they both headed over to the front desk to check in. A few moments later, after getting checked in, Fun and Yomi wheeled their suitcases into a tiny elevator. And as soon as they got inside, Fun noticed that Yomi was staring at her room key with a very worried expression, and Fun knew why. The front desk clerk had given Yomi a room on the 4th floor. And in China, the number 4 is supposed to be very unlucky because the word for 4 sounds like the word for death in the Chinese language. Many buildings in China do not even have a 4th floor for this very reason, but this old hotel did, and Yomi had just been assigned to it. Now, Fun was not that superstitious, but he knew Yomi really was. I mean, to be given a room on the 4th floor was bad, but it went deeper than that for Yomi. This was a bad start, but Yomi was the type of person who, back home at their work building, she would not even go to the end of hallways within their building. She would avoid the end of hallways because she believed that is where spirits would congregate. So, she avoided the end of hallways. And she also avoided looking in mirrors or reflective surfaces because she believed that if you did that, your soul could be trapped inside of those alternate universes, inside of these reflective surfaces. And so, he just knew this was a big deal for her and this was going to probably totally disrupt this trip. So Fun. He looked at Yomi and as gently as he could, he told her, hey, don't worry about it. Like, don't freak yourself out. I'm sure it's fine. And Yomi, she nodded like she was agreeing with him, but she just kept staring at the room key like this is not okay. She was telling him it was going to be okay, but not to her. This was bad. Eventually, the elevator reached the 3rd floor, and the doors opened up, and Fun got off because his room was on the 3rd floor. And he turned to Yomi, who again was still just staring at the room key, and he told her, hey, I'm going to get settled in, and then I'll give you a call. Everything is going to be fine. All right? And Yomi, she just nodded, but kept on staring at the room key. And Fun watched as the door shut, and she just continued up to the 4th floor by herself. Less than 10 minutes later, when Fun was in his room, he was still putting his stuff away. He had not even had a chance to call Yomi yet. As he is getting settled in, basically he sees his cell phone is ringing, and it is Yomi. So he is like, okay, picks it up and says hello, and she is totally frantic, crying and breathing heavily in a state of absolute pure terror. And she says to him that she has to switch her room immediately. She said, not only was her room on the 4th floor, which was bad enough, but the room was at the very end of the hallway, the exact place she believed spirits gathered. And then when she went inside of her room, which took a lot of courage because she did not even want to go in the room at all, she said there were reflective surfaces and mirrors everywhere. It was like she could not avoid looking at herself in these reflective surfaces. And she said on top of that, the air was just weirdly still and heavy, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread the moment she crossed the threshold. She said it just felt awful in there, and she could not be in there. This was a perfect storm of all of the things that scare her, all in one, and she cannot do it. She has to change rooms. As Fun listened to this, he could not help but kind of roll his eyes. This just seemed like a little bit of an overreaction from Yomi. He got it, and he understood why she was upset, but it was like, come on. But he wanted this trip to go well, and he did like Yomi. He wanted her to be happy because her mood affected him and this whole trip. And so he just told her, look, stay put. I'll take care of it. Then he left his room, went down to the front desk, and spoke to the front desk clerk. After a bit of negotiating, they swapped Yomi to a room on the 3rd floor. It was not at the end of the hall, it was right in the middle of the hall. Perfect. And so Fun, he grabs this new room key, goes up to the 4th floor, where he finds Yomi, who is standing frozen in the middle of the hallway. She had not put anything inside of her room, she had abandoned her room. Then she was so relieved to see him. He gives her the new key, and she is very thankful. Down to the 3rd floor they go, and she heads off to her new room, thanking him again. And Fun goes into his room thinking, okay, problem solved. The next morning, Fun went down to the hotel's dining area for breakfast. A few minutes later, Yomi joined him. But the moment she sat down, Fun immediately noticed that she seemed really low energy, like super lethargic or something. She grabbed her food, sat down next to him, and she was not talking, and she was barely eating her food, and she had this distant look in her eyes. Every time he would speak to her, she really did not engage with him. It was like she was not even hearing him, just giving him like one-word answers in a low, flat whisper. She just felt totally off, and her eyes had a distant, hollow look in them. And so Fun was definitely worried about Yomi, but also, selfishly, he was worried about himself. He was thinking she seemed like she could have picked up maybe like a travel bug, like maybe she was sick or something, and it really stressed him out because he really did not want to get sick during this work trip. And so he just hoped that whatever was going on with her was not contagious, and he decided to keep a bit of distance from her for the rest of the day. Around lunchtime, Fun and Yomi were joined by 3 other coworkers who had come in on a later flight. And one of them was actually their manager, a guy named Sai, along with 2 other coworkers, Chen and Xiao. And so Sai had the whole group meet up in his room so they could all go over the schedule for the rest of the week and prepare for their business meetings. But as soon as the whole group assembled in his room and the meeting began, everybody just wanted to complain about how terrible this hotel was and how silly it was that the company made them stay here. The 2 new coworkers complained about the smell and the dirty rooms, and in fact, one of them said, you know what, I'm just going to check out and just go to a different hotel. Like, I can't be here. But Sai shut that idea down right away, saying, you know what, that is way too expensive and way too time-consuming to move at this point. And then he just kind of shifted the whole conversation back to business, and he moved quickly through the entire meeting agenda for the week. And then when they were done, Yomi and the others left to go back to their own rooms. Well, they all left except for Fun. Fun stayed back to use Sai's bathroom. So Sai was outside in his room, and Fun was in the bathroom. And then when Fun was done, he came back out, and he was about to say goodbye and leave when he looked into the room and he saw Sai. And Sai was sitting on the very edge of the bed, staring blankly at the dark screen of the television set, and he had this weird look on his face, like a very troubled expression of absolute shock and horror. His skin was pale and he was completely frozen, and so Fun walks over to Sai and says, "Hey, are you okay?" And Sai would not tell him. Like, clearly something was wrong, but he would not tell him at first. He just kept staring at the dark TV screen. Finally, he turned his head slowly to look at Fun. In a trembling, serious voice, he told Fun that he had changed his mind about this hotel and said, "We need to leave this hotel immediately, no matter the cost." A few hours later, the whole group checked out of the crappy hotel, packed their bags into a taxi, and moved their whole operation to a newer, beautiful, modern hotel downtown in the city center. And on their way to their new rooms, Fun, who was in great spirits about this change, made a comment to Yomi about how much better this place was. But Yomi just kind of ignored him. She moved like a ghost, took her new key card, went straight to her room, and locked the door behind her. The next morning, everyone met up in the lobby for breakfast again, except for Yomi. She did not show up. And so eventually Fun called up to her room, and when she picked up, she sounded really groggy and weak. And then she said she definitely had a fever, like she was sick and felt too weak to get out of bed. And when Fun heard that, he was like, "Man, I sat next to her on the plane, I have eaten with her at every meal, I have been near her this whole time. If she is sick, I am probably next." But he also felt totally normal right now. So he just hoped that whatever Yomi had, one, it was not too serious for her sake, but two, it was not that contagious. And over the next few days, Fun did not get sick. So for him, he was thinking, great, I have been spared. But Yomi's situation, her fever only got worse. And she also started acting just really strange. She would lock herself inside of her room for hours at a time, refusing to eat, do any work, or talk to anyone, which was obviously really bizarre on a business trip where the expectation is, you are going to do a lot of eating and talking to people. And then on the rare occasions where she would come out of her room, Fun noticed that her eyes seemed like lifeless, like her mind was just somewhere else entirely. It was like she had this constant 1,000-yard stare going on, her skin was gray, and her lips were chapped. By Thursday, 5 days into this trip, everybody was really worried about Yomi. Fun actually took her to see a doctor at a local clinic, and the doctor examined her but could not tell what was causing her fever. But he gave her antibiotics and then told her what she really needed was to leave this business trip and just go home and rest. And when their manager, Sei, heard this recommendation from the doctor, he actually offered to buy Yomi a ticket to fly back home that very night. But to all of their surprise, Yomi flatly refused to leave. She became agitated, went back to her hotel room, closed the door, and locked it. 3 days later, on the evening of Sunday, March 24th, the work trip was now over, and all 5 of them needed to leave for the airport to go back home. But Yomi was refusing to leave. She was not coming out. Fun and Sai stood in the hallway outside of Yomi's room. Sei knocked loudly on the door and shouted for Yomi to come out. But finally, Fun and Sai heard the sound of feet shuffling to the door inside of the hotel room, though she did not open the door. She called out to them in a very weak and distant voice that they should just leave. Take your flight, go home. I'll catch my own flight in the morning once I feel a bit better. Fun was about to argue with her, wanting to force her to come with them, when Sai raised his wrist and showed him his watch. And Fun realized that if they were going to catch their own flight, they had to leave right now. And so Sei called back through the door that he would book Yomi her own ride to the airport if she just sent him her new flight information, but for right now, they really had to go. Best of luck, but we got to go. And so Fun, even though he felt pretty conflicted about what to do here, ultimately decided that they had done everything they could, and he just followed his manager down to the lobby and got into their waiting taxi. And as they got in the car, Fun thought to himself, it's like Yomi, she is an adult, and if she thinks she is too sick to travel and she wants to fly home on her own the next day, that is her decision, but Yomi did not find her own way home because 2 days later, she was dead. That day, March 26th, Fun was sitting at his desk at work when he got a call from the company's Human Resources department with the news. The hotel staff had apparently entered Yomi's room to clean it after she failed to check out, and they found her lifeless body inside of her room. The exact condition of her body was not shared, and the cause of death was officially listed as sudden death caused by various medical complications. When Fun heard this, he was devastated. He had known that Yomi clearly was sick, but he had never thought she was close to dying. And so now he was just overcome with grief at the loss of his friend, but also some level of guilt, wondering if he should have forced her to go to the hospital or stayed behind with her, and just confusion around this whole thing. Fun's best guess was that she must have caught some highly aggressive virus or infection, and she very likely caught it on the first day when they were at that totally gross, unsanitary hotel. But Fun also knew that he very likely would never get a real answer. And so ultimately, Fun just tried to move on, and he kind of tried to bury his thoughts around the business trip because it was just so raw and he just did not have any answers. And so he just thought it was best to push it over here and just go on with life. And that strategy pretty much worked until 2 years later, in November of 2021. That month, Fun met up with his former manager, Sai, who was on that fateful trip, for drinks at a quiet bar. Immediately after that business trip, the whole group had been so traumatized that they really did not discuss what happened much. They talked about the fact that obviously Yomi had died, but nobody got into details because it was just too raw. But now that some time had passed, Sai and Fun spent the whole time over drinks talking about Yomi and the trip, and Fun asked Sai if he agreed that Yomi must have just caught her illness that killed her while staying at that first hotel. Do you think that is what it was? Just an unsanitary place, she got sick, she died. Do you think that is what happened? But to Fun's surprise, Sai just slowly shook his head, took a drink, and said, "No, I don't think that's what happened." Then he asked Fun if he remembered that moment in the first hotel when Fun had come out of the bathroom and found Sai sitting in front of the TV acting sort of funny. Fun says, "Yeah, I asked you what was wrong, and you would not tell me, and then you said we need to switch hotels immediately. I do remember that. I thought that was weird." And so Fun was confused by what his manager was asking him, wondering why he was asking about that moment, and he stared at Sai, and Sai looked back at him for a really long moment, just staring right at Fun. And then eventually he told Fun that he had it all backwards about Yomi. He said Yomi did not catch something from that first hotel, the hotel caught Yomi. Sai explained to Fun that while he was still in the bathroom inside of the same room, Sai said he turned on the TV using the remote control. But the screen remained dark, acting like a polished black mirror. He was just looking at the dark screen for a moment, and then he saw something inside of the glass that was impossible, and it immediately indicated to him that something was terribly wrong with this hotel. He told Fun that what he saw inside of the screen was Yomi. It was her face. It was like she was trapped inside of the reflective surface of the TV, and she had this look of absolute terror on her face, and her eyes were wide with horror, and she was pressed against the inside of the glass, silently screaming and begging him to help her. It was as if her spirit had been pulled into the reflective surface of the television set and trapped there. And Sai said he was so frightened that his first instinct was, "I have to switch hotels, I need to save Yomi." But he said, "Fun, when you came out and you asked me what was wrong, I didn't even know how to explain what was happening. I just knew that Yomi's life was at stake here." And so Sai said to Fun that they switched hotels, but it was already too late. Yomi's spirit was trapped inside of that first hotel. It had her spirit, and so her body went to the new hotel, but not with her spirit. She was like a ghost, and that is what killed her. Her physical body withered away until it finally stopped functioning. Fun would eventually write a detailed, long-form account of this business trip and post it on popular Chinese social media. And right away, lots of people read it and were really intrigued by it. And so, internet sleuths who were taken with the story would actually locate court records from a lawsuit that was related to Yomi's death filed by her family against the hotel. But the lawsuit did not really talk about all the weird stuff that Fun detailed in his account. Really, it was just sort of matter of fact. And in fact, really all it said about her death was that it was classified as sudden death caused by various medical complications. However, not long after Fun's story basically went viral on Chinese social media, right as people were really trying to dig into this and see what really happened to Yomi, around that same time, the Chinese government intervened. Citing strict content regulations regarding the spread of superstition, paranoia, and societal fear, they permanently deleted Fun's post and removed all discussions of the case from the internet. And so all that is left now from the story, at least from Fun's version of the story, are a few scattered screenshots taken by quick-thinking users who read his account at the time and wanted to preserve it before the government wiped the story from existence. One afternoon in the spring of 1948, a 12-year-old girl named Maggie sat by an open window in her kitchen at her home in a quiet, tree-lined suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina. Maggie had her school books spread out in front of her, and she was trying to do her homework, but she could not focus because the entire neighborhood was way too quiet. The spring breeze was warm, and she sat at the wooden kitchen table looking out at the manicured lawns. Normally at this time of day, which is when Maggie typically did her homework, her neighbor would play his violin in his den, and the music always helped Maggie study, filling her kitchen with the most wonderful, complex classical melodies. But for the past few weeks, her neighbor's house had been completely silent, and the reason for that was pretty tragic. So Maggie's neighbor was 19-year-old Kenneth Null, and he was like this unbelievably talented musician. As a young child, he had been like this violin prodigy, possessing an extraordinary natural talent. And now, as a 19-year-old, he was like on another level with how good he was at playing that instrument, playing difficult pieces with an ease and emotion that left everyone completely spellbound. And so it was basically common knowledge in their small community that someday, probably soon, he was going to be famous, performing on the world's biggest stages. However, just a few weeks ago, Kenneth had been in a terrible car accident. He was driving a black Ford coupe when his tires lost traction on a wet curve and his car went off the road. His right arm was caught in the wreckage and completely mangled, destroying the nerves and muscles. Doctors said he would never regain full use of his arm again, which meant his violin career was over before it had even truly begun. Maggie knew that Kenneth was just completely devastated. His whole life had been built on playing the violin. It is like, what is he going to do now? And furthermore, Maggie herself had barely seen him leave the house since he got home from the hospital. He had become a complete recluse. He never came outside to sit on the porch, he never walked down the street, and the curtains of his house remained tightly drawn at all hours of the day. It was like he was a shut-in. It was like his life was wrecked, and he was feeling sad and hopeless inside that dark, silent house. And so for Maggie, as she sat there by the window, listening to the silence, she just could not take it anymore. She just really wanted to help Kenneth, even if it was something small, because he really had helped her a great deal over the many times she had done her homework listening to his music. She wanted to return the favor. So, she got up from the table, walked over to the cupboard, and searched the shelves. On the top shelf, she found a chocolate candy bar that she had been saving, and she decided she would go next door, give this to Kenneth, and hope it would cheer him up. A few minutes later, Maggie was standing on Kenneth's front porch, having crossed the grassy lawn separating the two properties. She had her candy bar hidden behind her back, and with her other hand, she was knocking gently on the wooden front door. She stood there waiting for what felt like a long time. She was just about to turn around and leave, thinking no one was going to answer, when she heard the slow sound of the lock turning. The door opened, and it was Kenneth. And immediately, Maggie could tell that even though she knew Kenneth was probably not doing well, he looked awful. He was in really bad shape, looking incredibly frail and exhausted. His damaged right arm was bound tightly in a thick, white cloth sling pressed across his chest, and his hair was greasy and unwashed, and there were deep, dark circles under his hollow eyes, suggesting he had not slept in days. To Maggie, it just seemed like Kenneth was extremely depressed, extremely sad, looking like a shadow of his former self. So, she did the thing she came over here to do. She pulled the chocolate candy bar out from behind her back, handed it to him, and she just said, "I hope you feel better." And Kenneth, despite looking so pained, smiled, and he looked genuinely touched by this kind gesture. He reached out with his left, uninjured arm, gently pulled Maggie into a one-armed hug, and thanked her sincerely for coming over to see him. And then Maggie, speaking from the heart, told Kenneth that she really missed him playing the violin after school each day. She said that his music was so beautiful and that the neighborhood felt empty without it. And to Maggie's surprise, Kenneth's smile faded slightly, and his expression became deeply serious. He looked down at her and made a quiet, solemn promise. He told her not to worry, because he would find a way to play the violin again. He said that playing the violin was his entire life, and if he could not do it, he would not want to go on living. Maggie felt a shiver run down her spine at the intensity of his words, but she simply nodded, waved goodbye, and walked back to her house, hoping that her visit had helped lift his spirits. A few weeks passed, and the neighborhood remained quiet. Maggie did her homework in silence, always looking out the window at the dark house next door, hoping to see some sign of life. One night, a few weeks later, around midnight, Maggie was fast asleep in her bed. Suddenly, she was startled awake by a sound drifting through her open bedroom window. She sat up in bed, holding her breath, and listened intensely. She gasped because immediately she recognized the melody, and she knew that Kenneth was playing his violin again. It was a complex, beautiful classical piece, and the precision and emotion of the playing could only belong to one person. Maggie was so excited that, even though it was the middle of the night, she climbed out of bed, slipped on her shoes, and quietly ran down the hallway and went out her front door into the cool night air. A minute later, Maggie was once again standing on Kenneth's front porch. The night air was cool, and the music grew louder and clearer as she walked toward his house. It was absolutely breathtaking. She knew that Kenneth and his mother often left the front door unlocked, and Maggie wanted to surprise him and congratulate him on his incredible recovery. And so Maggie, who was just so excited, reached down and tried the handle, and it was unlocked. She gently pushed the door open and stepped into the dark entryway of the house. Inside, she had been listening to Kenneth's music this whole time, but it was sort of muffled because it was outside the house. Now she was in the entryway of the home and she could hear it. It was so much louder and it was so beautiful. It seemed to fill every inch of the house, vibrating through the wooden floorboards and echoing off the walls. For a moment, she just stood there, listening to what in her mind was like the most beautiful music she had ever heard in her life. It sounded as if he was playing with a level of passion and skill that surpassed anything he had done before his accident. And so she stood there just listening to the music, and eventually she decided to just go into the den to go find Kenneth and actually watch him play right in front of her. She wanted to see it, she wanted to experience it again, and she wanted to congratulate him. And so into the den she goes, walking slowly down the hallway toward the source of the sound, but the moment she steps through the threshold and she is in the den, the music stops. The exact millisecond her foot crossed the threshold into the room, the music stopped, the silence was sudden, absolute, and incredibly heavy. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. The house was eerily quiet, and she looked around, thinking he might have heard her enter and had stopped playing out of surprise or embarrassment. She looked around, and at first she did not even see him. It was dark in the den. She whispered his name, but there was no response. The silence in the house was deafening. But then she walked further into the room, looking around the dark space, and her eyes fell upon the couch against the far wall. In the pale moonlight, she looked at the couch and she screamed. On the couch was Kenneth, and he was very clearly dead. His face was pale and lifeless, and his body was stiff and cold. In his cold, rigid hands, he was clutching his beloved violin tightly against his chest. Maggie let out a terrifying, high-pitched scream that echoed through the house, waking Kenneth's mother, who rushed into the room. An ambulance and the police were called to the scene immediately, but there was nothing they could do. A doctor would later determine that Kenneth had died of a cerebral hemorrhage, which had killed him instantly. But the most baffling and chilling part of the investigation was the timing of his death. The medical examiner concluded that Kenneth had passed away and his body had gone into rigor mortis at least 2 hours before Maggie first woke up and heard that music. There was absolutely no physical way Kenneth could have been playing the violin at midnight. Yet Maggie had heard the music clearly, and she had followed the sound of his impossible performance right to his side. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.